Welcome to the world today. There are certain flashpoints on the world map that are not merely bodies of water, shipping lanes, or isolated military standoffs. There are places where a single gunshot, one intercepted vessel, or one missile striking the sea can send shockwaves through global oil markets, international supply chains, national economies, and the daily lives of billions of people. Today, the world's attention is fixed on the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategic maritime choke points on Earth. Often described as the energy lifeline of the global economy, it is not only a vital passage for oil, liquefied gas, and international trade, but also the stage for a dangerous confrontation involving the United States, Iran, and other regional actors. At first glance, this may appear to be a story about several oil tankers being disabled, scattered clashes at sea, or a series of strong statements from Washington and Tehran. But beneath the surface, the picture is far more serious. This is a story about control over energy, military power, diplomatic leverage, maritime security, oil prices, environmental risks, and the possibility that a regional confrontation could spiral beyond anyone's original calculations. In this episode, The World Today takes you through the latest developments, examines the deeper meaning behind each move, and looks at the risks facing the world if the Strait of Hormuz remains trapped in a cycle of confrontation. The first major development concerns reports from Iranian media that US and Iranian forces exchanged fire near the Strait of Hormuz amid rising military tensions between the two sides. According to the original report, gunfire and explosions were heard in the area for approximately 2 hours. This is an extremely important detail, because it suggests that the ceasefire, even though Washington still says it remains in effect, is becoming increasingly fragile. In military crises, the most dangerous moment is not always a carefully planned attack. Sometimes the greater danger comes from an accident, an overreaction, a miscalculation, or a decision made within seconds at sea. When both sides have heavy military assets operating in a narrow area, warships, commercial vessels, fighter jets, drones, and missiles, the risk of unintended confrontation rises dramatically. Even more significantly, US Central Command, commonly known as CENTCOM, was reported to have confirmed that 2 Iranian-flagged oil tankers were intercepted before entering an Iranian port in the Gulf of Oman. According to the account, a US F/A-18 Super Hornet fighter jet launched from an aircraft carrier fired precision-guided munitions at the ship's smokestacks, disabling them and preventing them from continuing their voyage. From a military standpoint, this was designed as a disabling action rather than a sinking operation. But politically, it sends a very powerful message. Washington wants to demonstrate that its blockade against vessels entering or leaving Iran is not merely a declaration on paper, but a policy being enforced by real military power. For Tehran, however, this is a direct challenge to its sovereignty and maritime access. That is why every intercepted ship, every warning shot, and every precision strike can become a new spark in a wider confrontation. The key question is, why is the Strait of Hormuz so important that all sides appear willing to push tensions to the edge of conflict? The answer lies in its strategic position. Hormuz is one of the most important oil transit routes in the world. A significant portion of global crude oil and liquefied gas exports from the Middle East must pass through this narrow waterway before reaching Asia, Europe, and other markets. If shipping through Hormuz is disrupted, oil prices can swing sharply, maritime insurance costs can surge, transport expenses can rise, and consumers far from the battlefield may ultimately pay the price through higher fuel, gas, logistics, and consumer goods costs. That is why a senior advisor to Iran's leadership was quoted as saying that control over the Strait of Hormuz is worth as much as possessing a nuclear bomb. This is not merely dramatic language. It reflects Tehran's strategic understanding that Hormuz is a powerful bargaining chip. Iran may face sanctions, pressure, and military containment, but if it retains the ability to disrupt this vital maritime corridor, it still holds a card that forces the world to pay attention. From Washington's perspective, the message is equally clear: Iran must not be allowed to obtain nuclear weapons, threaten freedom of navigation, or turn Hormuz into a military bargaining tool. President Donald Trump, according to the original script, continued to warn Tehran against escalation while leaving open the possibility of a broader agreement. Yet the suggestion that a deal could happen any day, or might not happen at all, shows that diplomacy is moving alongside military deterrence, not replacing the risk of conflict. While military and diplomatic statements continue to unfold, another deeply concerning issue has emerged: the environmental situation in the Gulf. The original script mentioned oil slicks visible on the sea surface near Iranian islands and energy infrastructure, including areas around Karg Island, Lavan Island, and other waters close to key shipping routes. If these oil slicks are indeed connected to attacks or tanker incidents, then this is not only an economic or military crisis, it is also an environmental one. Oil spills do not disappear overnight. They can reach coastlines, kill marine life, damage fisheries, poison coastal waters, and threaten coral ecosystems, sea turtles, seabirds, and coastal communities. For Gulf countries, where many people rely on the sea for their livelihoods, the consequences could last for years. A conflict that strikes oil facilities does not only raise global energy prices, it leaves environmental scars that are extremely difficult to heal. And here lies a painful irony. While the world worries about oil shortages because Hormuz may be blocked, oil itself may already be spreading across the sea. Energy that cannot reach the markets where it is needed may instead become a toxic layer over the waters that sustain life. At the same time, the original script also refers to a significant diplomatic development: a one-page US peace proposal for Iran. Although described as brief, the memorandum reportedly contains terms that could reshape the regional landscape. The core issues include Tehran's nuclear program, a long-term suspension of uranium enrichment, the gradual easing of economic sanctions, the release of frozen Iranian assets, and the restoration of freedom of navigation through Hormuz. From a diplomatic perspective, this may represent a real opportunity to reduce tensions. Iran needs relief from economic pressure. The United States needs an agreement strong enough to show that Tehran cannot move toward nuclear weapons. Regional countries need Hormuz reopened. Global energy markets need stability. But the problem is that trust between Washington and Tehran has been deeply eroded over many years. After the United States withdrew from the nuclear agreement in 2018, Tehran became far less willing to trust American commitments. At the same time, the United States and its allies suspect that Iran may use negotiations to buy time, preserve its nuclear leverage, and strengthen its regional position. Therefore, even a short and practical memorandum must answer major questions: who will monitor compliance? How will inspections work? What is the schedule for sanctions relief? What happens if one side violates the agreement? And most importantly, can both militaries remain restrained while diplomats are still negotiating? This is where the situation becomes especially dangerous. Diplomacy needs time, but the battlefield moves by the minute. A ship attacked, a drone shot down, a base targeted, or a sailor killed could be enough to collapse the negotiating table. The crisis no longer involves only the United States and Iran. European powers are also becoming more active. According to the original script, France has deployed the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier group closer to the Middle East as part of a multinational initiative led by France and the United Kingdom to restore maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz when conditions allow. This move carries several meanings. First, Europe does not want the entire Hormuz issue to be controlled solely by Washington. Second, European countries have direct interests in protecting trade and energy routes. Third, France and the United Kingdom want to build a security presence described as neutral and focused on freedom of navigation. But in practice, deploying aircraft carriers, destroyers, fighter jets, and military forces near a flashpoint is always a double-edged sword. It can reassure shipping companies, but it can also make the area more militarized. It may deter some attacks, but it also increases the risk of accidental confrontation. In a narrow waterway like Hormuz, the more military forces are present, the more complicated coordination becomes. Another important detail is the reported attack on a French-linked container ship in the area, injuring several crew members. Even though the vessel was not flying the French flag, the incident still puts Paris under pressure to respond. For shipping companies, only a few such attacks are enough to change their entire route planning. They may choose longer routes, increase transport prices, demand higher insurance coverage, or suspend passage through the area altogether. When that happens, the cost gradually spreads into global commodity prices. The original script also mentions that the United States has announced the end of a previous military campaign and the beginning of a new phase focused on maritime security in Hormuz. Regardless of the name of the operation, the essence remains the same. Washington wants to maintain pressure on Iran while reopening one of the world's most important shipping lanes. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was quoted as saying that America is trying to restore freedom of navigation. But he also warned that if Iran attacks U.S. assets or commercial vessels in transit, Washington will respond and reserve the right to use force. This is a clear deterrent message. The United States is saying that its maritime protection campaign will not be passive. If attacks occur, it may strike back. However, Iran sees the situation differently. From Tehran's point of view, the U.S. military presence in the Gulf has long been viewed as strategic pressure. If the United States is blockading Iranian ports, escorting commercial vessels through Hormuz, and disabling Iranian-flagged ships, Tehran may interpret this as de facto encirclement. When both sides believe they are acting defensively, escalation becomes much harder to control. The original script also refers to U.S. airstrikes against vessels accused of drug trafficking in the Caribbean, raising concerns over international law. Although this issue is not directly tied to Hormuz, it adds to the broader picture of how Washington is using military power at sea. The United States argues that these operations are legal under its campaign against drug trafficking groups. However, international law experts have raised concerns that attacking civilian vessels suspected of criminal activity, if there is no immediate violent threat, may exceed legal limits. This highlights a wider problem. In today's world, the boundaries between law enforcement, counter-terrorism, anti-smuggling operations, military blockades, and conventional warfare are becoming increasingly blurred. When a state labels a group as a combat target, it may expand its use of force. But without strict oversight, international law faces serious challenges. Back in the Middle East, the international community continues to call for de-escalation. Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Brazil, and others have expressed concern. This is understandable, because no country wants Hormuz to become a wider battlefield. Oil exporters fear losing revenue. Oil importers fear rising energy prices. Shipping companies fear insecurity. Economies still recovering from previous shocks fear the return of inflation. And ordinary people, whether in the Middle East, Asia, Europe, or elsewhere, ultimately feel the impact through higher fuel prices, transport costs, and living expenses. One particularly dangerous issue is the possibility that the conflict may spread to Gulf countries such as the United Arab Emirates. According to the original script, Iran was accused of striking targets in the UAE, including areas linked to ports and oil infrastructure. If such attacks continue, the confrontation will no longer be limited to the United States and Iran around Hormuz. It could pull more allies, partners, and regional forces into the conflict. The UAE plays a key strategic role because some of its ports can help move goods and oil without relying entirely on the Strait of Hormuz. If those ports are also threatened, the strategic message is powerful. Even alternative routes are no longer completely safe. For energy markets, this is an extremely sensitive signal. Against this backdrop, the United States and Israel are reportedly discussing response options. Possible choices may include precision strikes against launch sites, coastal military targets, or Iranian energy infrastructure, but any response would require careful calculation. If it is too weak, it may fail to deter Iran. If it is too strong, it may pull the region back into full-scale war. This is the hardest equation in every crisis. How do you deter without forcing the other side to retaliate? How do you defend allies without becoming the side that triggers a new escalation cycle? How do you preserve strategic credibility while keeping the diplomatic door open? The original script also says South Korea is considering coordination or participation in maritime security activities around Hormuz after a South Korean cargo ship was damaged. This detail shows that the Hormuz crisis is no longer a Middle Eastern issue alone. Asian countries, many of which depend heavily on energy imports from the region, have direct interests in keeping the route secure. If South Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Indian, or Southeast Asian vessels are affected, domestic political pressure in those countries will rise. Their governments will have to balance several priorities: supporting maritime security, maintaining ties with the United States, avoiding confrontation with Iran, and protecting their own economic interests. This is not an easy balance. Another part of the original script shifts to the Israel-Hezbollah battlefield and the growing role of FPV drones. At first glance, this may seem separate from Hormuz, but it actually connects to a much larger military trend. Inexpensive technology is challenging expensive defense systems. Small, flexible, low-cost FPV drones can attack tanks, armored vehicles, military bases, and infrastructure with surprising effectiveness. Meanwhile, active protection systems such as Israel's Trophy system, which were designed mainly to intercept traditional anti-tank missiles, can struggle against small, slow-moving targets that change direction and attack from above. This reflects a major transformation in modern warfare. The most expensive weapon does not always win. A device costing hundreds or a few $1,000s may threaten military equipment worth millions. From Ukraine to the Middle East, from the Red Sea to the Gulf, drones are changing the tactical balance. For Hormuz, this is especially worrying. Massive commercial ships, oil tankers, container vessels, and warships can all be threatened by missiles, suicide drones, unmanned boats, or swarms of small craft. It is not necessary to sink an aircraft carrier to create global shock. Damaging a major oil tanker or causing an explosion at a strategic port may be enough to shake global markets. Meanwhile, Israel is also preparing for the worst-case scenario. According to the original script, several major Israeli cities have reopened public shelters and raised civil defense readiness. This suggests that Israeli authorities are not ruling out the possibility that a Gulf crisis could trigger attacks against Israel's home front, even if current assessments suggest that direct escalation may still be contained. Reopening shelters is not only a technical measure, it is also a political and social signal. Authorities want to show citizens that they are prepared, but at the same time, it increases public anxiety. When cities must inspect shelters and tens of thousands of residents are reminded of missile and drone attack scenarios. Civilian life has already been pulled under the shadow of war, even before explosions are heard. So how should we understand the broader picture? It can be summarized in 3 layers of risk. The first is direct military risk. The United States and Iran are operating in the same narrow strategic space. Ship interceptions, warning shots, drone attacks, missile responses, and clashes involving small boats can escalate quickly. A tactical mistake can become a strategic crisis. The second is economic and energy risk. Hormuz is not just a sea lane, it is a vital artery of the global oil and gas market. If this route is disrupted for a prolonged period, oil prices, gas prices, shipping costs, and maritime insurance premiums may all rise sharply. People around the world could feel the impact through fuel prices, household gas bills, electricity costs, production expenses, and consumer goods prices. The third is the risk to the international order. If force is used more frequently at sea, if commercial ships become targets, and if international law is interpreted according to the interests of each major power, then freedom of navigation, one of the foundations of global trade, will be weakened. And this is the most worrying point. A crisis in Hormuz does not stay in the Middle East. It can appear in the fuel bill of a family in Asia, the shipping costs of a company in Europe, food prices in Africa, and the defense budgets of countries forced to protect their supply chains. In the coming hours and days, there are 3 signs to watch closely. First, will commercial vessels truly return to Hormuz in large numbers? If shipping companies continue to avoid the route, it means they still do not trust the security guarantees. Second, how will Iran respond to US escort and blockade operations? If Tehran continues harassment attacks, de-escalation will be difficult. If Iran restrains itself, diplomacy will have more room to work. Third, what happens to the proposed peace framework? If the 2 sides reach an agreement on the nuclear issue, sanctions, and freedom of navigation, the risk of war may decline. But if negotiations collapse, all the forces now deployed around Hormuz could become instruments of a new escalation. The world today depends heavily on narrow routes with enormous strategic value. One strait can affect global oil prices. One attacked vessel can shake the insurance market. One military decision made in minutes can destroy months of diplomacy. And one regional conflict, if not controlled, can become an international economic shock. The Strait of Hormuz today is not only a military flashpoint, it is a test of great power restraint. diplomatic endurance, international law, and the resilience of global trade. The biggest question now is not who has more warships, who has more missiles, or who can issue the strongest statement. The biggest question is whether all sides are wise enough to stop before a small incident becomes an uncontrollable crisis. Because if Hormuz is truly blocked, if oil is trapped at sea, and if commercial vessels no longer dare to pass through this vital corridor, the cost will not be paid only by the United States, Iran, or the Gulf states. The cost will be paid by the entire world. And when that happens, the sound of gunfire in a distant strait may echo through economies, businesses, households, and dinner tables across the planet. You are watching The World Today, where we do not simply report the news, but look deeper into the forces moving behind every major international event. If you found today's program valuable, please continue to follow, share, and stay with us for our next analysis. The world is changing by the hour, and in an age of uncertainty, understanding the truth behind events is the best way to avoid being swept away by the waves of instability. Thank you for watching The World Today. We wish you safety, clarity, and calm in these turbulent times. See you again in our next global analysis.